Welcome and thank you for attending Digging Deep, Micronutrient Testing Pearls for Athletes. My name is Adair Anderson and I will be your moderator this evening. I will respond to the live chat and Q&A throughout the presentation, and following the presentation, we will have approximately 15 minutes for live Q&A. As a reminder, all attendees are in listen-only mode, so please submit your questions via the Q&A button on your Zoom navigation screen. The content of this webinar is for educational and informational purposes only. It is not clinical advice. If you desire medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment, please consult a medical professional or healthcare provider. And now, I am pleased to present today's presenter, Dr. Jason Barker, who is a clinical lab educator here at Vibrant. Dr. Jason Barker, ND, earned his Bachelor of Science in Exercise and Sports Science with a minor in Anatomy and Neurobiology from Colorado State University. He then earned his doctorate from Southwestern College of Naturopathic Medicine in 2001. He also completed a 2-year residency at the National University of Natural Medicine and earned a certificate in clinical research at Oregon Health and Sciences University. In addition to his 21 years of private practice, he also served as a clinical consultant to the nutraceutical and sports medicine industry, has authored numerous articles for the journals Alternative and Complementary Therapies, Natural Pharmacy, and the Townsend Letter, and is co-author of the book Herbs and Nutrients for the Mind, A Guide to Natural Brain Enhancers, and has lectured internationally on natural medicines. Dr. Barker is a recreationally competitive trail runner, triathlete, and skier, and enjoys spending time outside in beautiful Colorado with his 3 children. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Barker.
Thanks, Adair, for the introduction, and thanks everybody for tuning in on a Monday night. This is going to be a very informative and wide-ranging webinar on micronutrient testing for athletes, and this is one of my favorite subjects, so I'm excited to present this to you tonight. So first off, who are we talking about? What is an athlete? So these are some kind of loose definitions here. Obviously, there's a lot of differences in somebody who we would consider an athlete, but generally this is somebody who spends more than an hour a day exercising, perhaps. They engage in regular competition, whether that's a 5K every weekend, or maybe they're a marathon runner or a skier. So these people place a high value on training, the time commitment, and diet and competition. And, fitness is part of their lifestyle. So this leads me into my first and only lame joke of the night, and that is, how do you find the triathlete in the party? Or you could fill it in with, how do you find the marathon runner in the party? Or how do you find the CrossFitter in the party? The answer is you don't find them. They will find you. These are the people who walk up to you, and immediately after their first name, they'll tell you what sport they do and how it's a big part of their lifestyle. And actually, you'll never meet these people at a party because they're all at home in bed by 8 a.m. because they've got to get up at 4 a.m. to go training. So there you go. There's our one joke of the night, people. So statistics, though, 12% of the adult population, 18 and above, has participated in some form of an endurance sport. And then for this source, it was people that ran half marathons, triathlons, full Ironman triathlons, etc., obstacle races. 64% of endurance sports participants are in the 18 to 34 age range category, and 71% of those participants are men. And about 1.88 million Americans completed a triathlon in 2017. So this is obviously an older statistic here. Post-pandemic, of course, fitness and the interest in fitness has increased by quite a lot. We do know that participation in triathlons has decreased over the years, and more of these people who are doing triathlons are doing more of those obstacle and adventure races like Spartan races and Tough Mudders. These are where you see the pictures of the people crawling through the mud pit underneath the electrified barbed wire, jumping over a bonfire, et cetera, et cetera. All the more power to those folks. So I'd rather stay nice and dry on my bike. Okay, so why is testing so important for athletes? Well, there's a lot of different reasons here. And one of them is that we want to fine tune and cross-check that diet. So people will be on, athletes in general, obviously, are very health-minded. They're definitely going to be interested in following a nutritional diet. A lot of times these end up being some form of restrictive diet. That's not to say that with a negative connotation, but maybe somebody's gluten-free, or maybe they're vegan or vegetarian or paleo, fat adapted, carnivore. I'm not going to pick on any one particular diet at all. I think to each their own, but I am going to pick on the carnivore people tonight. That's also another joke. I'm not going to do that because everybody needs to be on their certain diet for various reasons. But anyway, we're going to use this test to cross-check that diet and make sure that it's actually the right choice for those people. Continuing on that, this group of people is more than likely to remove one or more food groups from that diet. So of course that can put them at risk for a nutrient or several nutrients deficiencies. One issue with this is that, especially with athletes, oftentimes they're concerned with maintaining a lean body mass. Most endurance sports, a leaner body mass is more favored. So a lot of times these people on surveys will report inadequate energy availability. So this just means they don't get enough calories to fuel their needs. In past years, we used to term this the female athletic triad. This is where we were seeing women who were amenorrheic. They'd lost their periods, they had osteoporosis, and they had disordered eating. This was kind of a pattern that we were seeing in female athletes, but fast forward 20 years, a more inclusive term for this that includes both of the sexes is RED-S. So this is relative energy deficiency of sport. So this is just a more inclusive term that signifies that a lot of athletes don't get enough nutrition to fuel their athletic needs. Now, another reason is that performance nutrition is so much just more than macros. So again, not picking on anybody, but it seems like a lot of the sports nutrition world is more focused on, getting X amount of carbohydrates, fats, and protein in. And if you do this and eat a well-rounded, healthy diet, then you'll automatically fill in those micronutrient needs. And all of us and those of us in functional medicine know that this necessarily isn't true. So we want to really pay attention to those micronutrients, and we can do that through this type of testing, because after all, the difference between victory, getting on the podium and not getting on the podium can be seconds and even hundredths of seconds in various sports. So we want to pull out all the stops that we can to help these athletes fuel as importantly as we can. And we can track a lot of that nutrition through this micronutrient test. And then lastly, nutrition is one of the training principles. So, or one of the training disciplines. So kind of a joke in the triathlon world is that there are 4 disciplines, swim, bike, run, and nutrition. And you could argue this is the same for any other sporting activity. Getting that nutrition dialed in and right is super important, and it's very challenging too. Okay, so Vibrance micronutrient test is a direct quantitative test. So we're actually looking at those nutrients that are in the serum and those that have been absorbed across the white blood cell and red blood cell membranes. So this is different than our competitors that use an indirect testing method via lymphocyte proliferation in a cell culture medium. So they're measuring the responses of those lymphocytes to sort of micronutrient bath that they're in. So it's more of an indirect method. I really prefer this one just because it shows, what you've got in your body at that time. And also provides that historical record of that nutrition, which we'll get into in the next couple of slides. So this test will measure 40 different micronutrients. So we're looking at all the main vitamins, handful of minerals, antioxidants, amino acids, and the red blood cell omega fatty acids, which is an important thing to consider with athletes too. And we'll get into that in the next couple of slides as well. Now, when you run the test, this is one of the first pages that you'll come across, and these are the dial charts. So what happens with these is that each nutrient is assigned a different weightage, depending on its importance in various body systems or functions. And the goal here is to get, in the green zone, which is above an 86. One of the common misconceptions with this is that just because you're up in the green zone in one of these areas means that all is well, that you don't have any health issues in that area. Of course, this is just a very broad general overview. One thing you want to keep in mind, though, is that with each of these dials is that, does this correlate with your clinical suspicion or with the patient's symptoms? As an example, in the musculoskeletal area here, you can see this person had a fairly low score. Maybe they presented with stress fractures or myalgia or joint pain or something along those lines. This would, of course, help draw your attention to that area. And then you can prioritize the different scores based on what's going on with your patient and your findings on these labs. And this next page is a different type of summary page, and I really like this one because it has a lot of different information in it. First off, you're going to see each nutrient that was found to be out of range, whether it was high or low. And remember, with our test, we're looking at two different compartments. We're looking at the cellular compartment and we're looking at the serum. So, and one thing to remember here is that the serum is just reflective of the last couple of days of nutrition. So what that athlete just ate in the last 2, maybe 3 days. And then the cellular compartment is more reflective of what they've eaten over the last month or 3 months, depending on which compartment we're measuring that in. And again, the majority of the nutrients on this test are measured in the white cells. So they typically have a lifespan of about 3 to 4 weeks. So that's one area of history you could kind of consider. And then nutrients that are measured in the red cells, of course, last 3 or 4 months. So that's going to give you a little bit longer of a history there. Now, when you see, you'll also notice these arrows, you either have a black arrow or a red arrow. A black arrow is indicative that the nutrient is high, but it's not clinically significant. There's no known associated risk with it being mildly elevated like that. So an example of this is like this person's B12 was a little bit elevated. There's no known risk with that, with just a minor elevation of that B12. Whereas when you see a red arrow, this is associated with clinically significant findings such as toxicity or a major nutritional deficit. So this will also help quickly draw your attention to a problem area. Whenever you've got a nutrient listed here, it's automatically going to populate with some nutritional sources. That's helpful, of course. So, you know, the goal of this is not necessarily going after supplementation, but of course, we're going to treat people with a diet first. So I like these little suggestions right here. And then there are 3 patterns to aid your interpretation of the micronutrient test. First one is, you know, are there more abnormalities in one or the other compartment? You know, do they have more serum abnormalities or do they have more cellular abnormalities, and how do those two relate? Secondly, do they have a lot of high arrows or do they have a lot of low arrows, deficiency? Is their serum all high, but their cellular is all low? That could mean that they have a problem with absorbing those nutrients. So that's another area to consider. And then the third way that I'll read and interpret this test is by looking at different groups of vitamins. So how do the fat solubles look? How do the B vitamins look? What do the antioxidants look like? What do the amino acids look like? What do the essential fatty acids look like? So lots of different ways to interpret this information because we're getting so much of it with this micronutrient test. Now, the rest of the tests, this is where the actual data is. And so you'll see that this is a numerical representation of those nutrients, again, in those 2 different compartments. You can see that asparagine was measured in the serum and the white cells, but not in the red cell. So there are going to be different compartments where specific nutrients are just better measured. So that's why you won't see every single nutrient measured in every single compartment here. And then on this picture I've got here, you're seeing a previous result and a current result that will automatically populate for you so you don't have to dig back through old labs, just a convenience factor there. Now, this is the numerical representation. Personally, or rather, let me go back quickly. So all this information is also conveyed in this next section of the test, which is just a graphical representation. I like pictures, so this is easier for me to read just because you can see where they are on that average, you know, if they're approaching the deficiency or overdose areas on here. So easier to read that for me. Personally, I like that part of the test. Now, a couple other ways to interpret this also. So when you're having an agreement or disagreement between the 2 different compartments, kind of 3 different ways to think about this. 5 questions you want to ask. You know, what is the intake of those micronutrients from either diet or supplementation? So, of course, you're going to want to know what this person's diet and supplementation regimen is like when you interpret these tests. And because if somebody's got high serum, like I mentioned before, and they have low amount in the cells, then we're going to be worried about something going on with that absorption of those nutrients. Other things to think about here are are there losses of micronutrients from various areas of the body, like the GI tract, the urinary tract, or the skin? And with endurance athletes, you bet we're losing nutrients at a much more rapid rate from a lot of these different compartments. And we'll kind of cover that in some subsequent slides as well. Now, third one, is there any reason for increased utilization of micronutrients in your athletes? Absolutely, yes. Right. All that training, you get people in who are training at 15, 20 hours a week. You bet they are going to be just chewing these nutrients up left and right. So another good reason to run this test is to make sure that they are getting adequate nutrients in their diet. Is cellular transporter problem? I alluded to this earlier. So when you're seeing high serum levels or adequate serum levels and low cellular levels, we're worried about what's going on with their membrane permeability. Do they have a lot of oxidation going on? Do they have an infection? Do they have a lot of inflammation? Is there toxicity present? So that's when you're going to have to do quite a bit more digging to figure out maybe why somebody is not absorbing those nutrients like you think they would. And then fifth question to ask is there a genetic polymorphism? So I will typically run 2 of these tests. We'll do the initial test, we'll initiate our treatment diet supplementation plan. We'll do a follow-up test a few months later. If we're still kind of not understanding why maybe somebody isn't absorbing their nutrients cellularly, then what I'll do is end up running Vibrant's other test, the NutriPro. The NutriPro includes this micronutrient panel, and it also looks at various single nucleotide polymorphisms that affect how we absorb certain nutrients. So it's very handy because that often will give you the answer if you've done everything else clinically and you're still not getting absorption the way you want. Maybe this person has a SNP. And the nice thing about that test too is it will provide you with specific nutrient dosing and recommendations so that you can kind of have a workaround with that. And the neat thing about this test is you only need to do it once in a person's life because those SNPs aren't necessarily going to change, but it's going to give you a wealth of information in that regard. Okay, and then the last part of the test are these bubble pages. These get generated when you've got a nutrient that's either that's out of range. I like this. It's just a brief little encyclopedic information about that nutrient. Tells you, how it works and clinical manifestations of depletion. Gives you a little bit of, I like the food sources again, because we're always going to try and be, supplementing people's diet with food first. And then, of course, there's going to be some supplement options down here too, if you need to go in that route as well. And then I like to show people this handout too, because those people who are not involved in health and wellness like we are don't necessarily understand the complexity with which nutrients are absorbed and digested. I think a lot of people think, put it down the old hatch, and then you're going to absorb it and metabolize it and utilize it. That's not very right. That's not true. There's a lot of different areas where things can go wrong. So if you've got inflammation in one part of this digestive tract, or maybe through the whole digestive tract, or the microbiome is off, et cetera, et cetera. So this just highlights the importance of, again, doing this testing so we can know how you're absorbing those nutrients and where those problem areas might be. Now, this slide, again, I'll use this as an educational tool, again, when we're deciding to run that micronutrient test. It just kind of briefly highlights which diets, which diets that have certain food restrictions on them put you at risk for which nutrients may be low, and then, some very quick solutions. Again, this is a very quick general slide that I'll show people just for some basic information. Now, this is a handout. This is a very useful handout. This is in your provider portal under the micronutrient, in the micronutrient folder. And this is going to tell us which micronutrient drug interactions there are. Because the long-term use of prescription and over-the-counter drugs can induce subclinical and clinically relevant micronutrient deficiencies, which can develop over months or even years. So this is important to take into consideration when you're testing people as possible reasons why those nutrients may be inadequate. And of course, I've highlighted NSAIDs on here that affects a couple of different nutrients. Of course, NSAIDs are every athlete's favorite medicine or drug to go to. Anything you can do to get people off of them, I would applaud. NSAIDs are terrible for the gut. And of course, they're going to limit the absorption of some of these key nutrients right here, vitamin C, iron, B6, and B9. Now, I just did a very quick list of the most common medications or drugs that I see athletes on. You will see some masters athletes taking statins. You'd think everybody would be on a CoQ10 who's prescribed a statin these days, but amazingly, you don't always see that. So that's an important thing to find out, to see, make sure they're supplementing with that one, because of course those statins will deplete that CoQ10 or inhibit its production rather. Proton pump inhibitors going to lower acidity in the gut. You're going to be missing out on a lot of minerals here. And the big one here is calcium. Again, keep this in mind. If you've got an athlete with fractures or stress fractures and they're on a proton pump inhibitor, not a good combination there. Oral contraceptives, of course, a lot of women are going to be using these as well. And we're looking at a lot of B6, or rather some of the B vitamin deficiencies that are possible, along with these other nutrients here as well. And then we see people on a lot of bronchodilators too. So these are asthma or reactive airway medicines. Beta-2 agonists are the rescue inhalers that people will take when they have an acute asthma situation going on. And then a lot of people are on these inhaled corticosteroids now too. With steroids, we always worry about calcium and of course vitamin D. And of course, there's a link between that and bone health as well. So these are just kind of the 5 most commonly seen medications that athletes are on. Of course, anybody can be on any kind of medication. So always good to look that up and keep that in mind when you run the micronutrient test. Okay, now this slide, I did not put this up here to traumatize you all with a picture of the Krebs cycle, but rather what I want to get out of this slide is that we produce a lot of energy in this cycle. Does anybody remember how many ATPs you produce from this? You produce 36. I had to look that up myself. Don't feel bad. But these little, the green writing on here are all the different micronutrients. And the point of this is that we need those micronutrients throughout the Krebs cycle to produce all that energy. So again, this is a good example of, sometimes I think we just eat the food and it goes in the body and it does what it does magically, but it really is important because just one missing micronutrient or insufficient micronutrient is going to leave you at an energy deficit. Of course, these people need as much energy as they can get. Now, athletes are going to have a higher demand for tissue repair, right? If you remember the training principles of overload, adaptation, and recovery, this means that when we overload the body, this is what training does. We break the body down on a microscopic level. This is why you're sore after a run or after lifting weights, because you've introduced micro tears in the muscle tissue and probably that connective tissue. So any type of training you're doing is breaking the body down. So obviously we want to rebuild it. These are some of the key nutrients that are involved in that. So of course, branched chain amino acids are very important for muscle protein synthesis. We will measure those on the micronutrient test. Essential fatty acids are also important in muscle protein synthesis. So long-term intake of omega-3s at about 4 grams a day can enhance the anabolic sensitivity to amino acids. So there's also some evidence that chronic supplementation with essential fatty acids can also limit muscle loss if somebody gets injured or has to become sedentary for something. And as you know, that muscle mass is a very hard-earned tissue that you don't want to give up at all if you can. Now, connective tissue. So this is kind of my latest rant these days is I don't think we as clinicians and sports nutritionists and clinicians that are interested in athletes pay enough attention to connective tissues. It seems like all the talk is about muscles, muscle strength, muscle recovery, muscle aches and pains. Of course, without that muscle or without connective tissue, those muscles aren't going to function as healthily as they can. So I'm really very interested in looking at these various nutrients that support collagen. Collagen being the most abundant protein in the body from which most of our connective tissue is made. So things like manganese helps free up proline by the prolidase enzyme. It's a cofactor in that enzyme. So of course, we're going to take proline, and vitamin C is going to turn proline into hydroxyproline for that connective tissue. Copper is going to help support cross-linking that collagen tissue. And then zinc is involved in collagenase as part of remodeling and reconstructing that collagen. So these handful of nutrients are super important when we're looking at rebuilding that connective tissue. Remember, connective tissue are things like your tendons, your ligaments, your cartilage, very important. Anybody that gets a connective tissue injury, that can be problematic, right? Because connective tissues are difficult to heal. They have a very poor blood supply by nature. So I'm really interested in making sure people are replete with these nutrients so that in the event of that injury, they're more ready to repair that. Also, remember, vitamin C is going to be important in our vegan and vegetarian athletes because it helps absorb that non-heme iron. So make sure we're paying attention to that vitamin C as well. And then glutamine, right? I think most of us understand the role of glutamine in gut repair. We'll talk in a few slides about why the gut is at risk in athletes. But glutamine also is really important in wound and injury repair. So this is one of the amino acids that the body relies on heavily whenever there's an injury. And I would consider, the aches and pains, the micro tears, the micro damage from training to be a type of injury. So I feel like glutamine is a very low risk supplement to give to athletes to help them with any kind of tissue recovery they need to do. And of course, to help that gut out. So this is a good one to measure on the test also before you go and supplement and or to make sure that they've got adequate levels of that. Okay, oxidation. So we know that endurance exercise creates quite a bit of oxidation. And of course, that oxidative stress consumes antioxidants and consumes those antioxidant nutrients. Now, it's a bit of a conundrum, though, because we know that during that intense exercise, that free radical production or those reactive oxygen and nitrogen species can actually inhibit muscular contractile function, leading to fatigue and poor performance. So we used to tell people to supplement with lots of antioxidants, but interestingly, chronic supplementation with antioxidants can actually blunt the training response. So it's very interesting. One study I just looked at was that when athletes were supplemented with just 400 units of vitamin E and 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C, this inhibited some of the training adaptations and even blocked the formation of PGC1, which is a master regulator in mitochondrial biogenesis, so the creation of more mitochondria. And that's one of the main training effects that we want to see are more mitochondria. So long story short, supplementing with too many antioxidants, it's going to inhibit those training adaptations. Yet, now, when we do nutritional surveys of athletes, there is evidence that many of their diets contain insufficient antioxidants to support their physical activity demands. So a little bit of a conundrum. So what do you do with antioxidants in your athletes? So what I would recommend is that first, you're obviously going to want to do this test and measure their antioxidants in their body. These are the key antioxidants that the test measures. If they're low, then perhaps they could benefit from some supplementation. Now, I just got done telling you that you don't want to supplement people chronically with antioxidants. So the approach I take is that if an athlete has a race, whatever, a 5K, a 10K, a marathon, triathlon, it doesn't really matter, I would recommend that they load up on antioxidants the day before that race so that their body can attenuate the production of those free radicals so that they're going to have less inhibition from that occurring. But then once that race is done and over, then go back to your normal amount of antioxidant intake, which we're going to do through the diet. So we're always going to make sure that their diet is replete in as many, polyphenol, antioxidant-rich foods as we can get them to have. So that's kind of the fine line that you'll walk with this. Testing and measuring is always a good idea. You'd be surprised that some people are really good at making plenty of glutathione without any supplementation. So it's kind of interesting to see how these different micronutrients come out on tests for different people based on their activity levels. Okay, so zooming in on a couple more specific performance-dependent nutrients, of course, iron. Iron gets, or oxygen is picked up by red blood cells and binds to that iron and hemoglobin. That's how we make energy, is by delivering all that oxygen throughout the body. But we know that athletes need more iron than the general population. In fact, when we compare iron losses in endurance athletes to the general population, athletes lose about 70% more iron than the general population does. So very high need for this nutrient. Now, we lose iron through sweat. You can lose it through the urine. You can lose it through the gut, because anytime you run or jostle your body about, the GI tract will bleed a little bit. This should not be visible blood, but you are losing some iron on a minuscule level that way. And of course, women through menstruation. So there's a lot of avenues through which people can lose iron. And in fact, the International Olympic Committee recommended back in 2009 that elite athletes or endurance athletes undergo routine screening for iron deficiency. And so I would encourage you to do the same for your athletes. If you get a low iron on this micronutrient test, then you definitely want to run an iron panel and a ferritin, and you can do that through Vibrant America testing. It's just the regular blood test that Vibrant offers instead of the functional medicine test, but you want to track that ferritin. Ferritin levels on average in women range from 12 to 150 nanograms per ml. Interestingly, lots of studies point to that when that ferritin approaches 50 or lower, a woman will feel as if she is anemic. She's not going to be anemic, but she's going to feel like it. So she's going to might have dizziness, headaches, trouble breathing, lethargy, etc. So that's an important one to keep track of. And again, don't ever let anybody get anemic, because that is a deep hole that they're going to be in for months. So this is why it's a good idea to do this micronutrient testing relatively frequently, so that you don't allow your athletes to descend into those deficiency states. Interestingly, rowers are very susceptible to iron loss, more so than other athletes. Strength training athletes are, and runners. This is primarily due to the phenomenon of foot strike hemolysis. So this is just red cells break due to the mechanical trauma of repeated pounding from running. One study showed that red cells last only 74 days. That's the average lifespan of red cells in runners is 74 days versus about 114 days in sedentary people. So quite a difference there. There's going to be a high recycling of those red cells. So again, keeping that iron, those iron stores up high is going to be really important. And of course, female athletes going to be more at risk due to menstruation. It's estimated that half of female athletes are going to experience iron deficiency at some point. Remember, guys lose iron too. Anytime somebody is going to be, or that you find they're iron deficient, that's going to be quite the deep dive clinically to figure out why, but these are just some of the main reasons that we see. And of course, not to pick on the vegans and vegetarians, I said I wasn't going to do it, but of course their diet is going to be, leaves them at more risk for absorbing less iron. And of course, again, remember, we want to keep that vitamin C up so it helps absorb that non-heme iron that they're consuming. Okay, vitamin D. So again, I think we all know the importance of vitamin D for the general population, but there's actually numerous benefits for athletes with vitamin D. And a lot of these are found when we take an athlete who is deficient in vitamin D, and then we make them sufficient through supplementation. You'll see an increased muscle protein synthesis rate. You'll see increases in ATP concentrations. You'll see improved strength, jump height, speed, and power, improved capacity to perform aerobic and anaerobic exercise. So VO2 max can actually improve a little bit with sufficient vitamin D levels. And then we also know that vitamin D prevents muscle degeneration and alleviates myalgia. I've had a large handful of athletes over the years who came in with aches and pains, and after we ruled everything out and noticed that they were insufficient with vitamin D, we're able to take care of that with just supplementing vitamin D. So it's a pretty quick turnaround with that. And then this last one is also very important. We know this, vitamin D is very integral to immunity. We're going to talk about the athlete's immune system in a couple of slides, but of course, making sure they're up to par with that vitamin D is going to keep them from getting sick. You don't want to have a sick athlete in your office who's grumpy because they're missing their race because they're ill. But remember, if somebody presents with stress fractures, those musculoskeletal aches and pains and frequent illness, that is definitely a trigger to make sure you check that vitamin D nutritional status with them. Okay, other nutrient combinations that are important for performance. So vitamin D, magnesium, and zinc are all associated with low testosterone levels. So, supplementing with these nutrients is not specifically going to raise testosterone, but I think we're in kind of an epidemic of a lot of men suffering from low testosterone. And so these are a few keys to that puzzle. Of course, I think the world is, say this a little bit tongue in cheek, but I think the world is overdosed on zinc after the pandemic. So be careful, supplementing that. Of course, you want to test before you supplement with that, with zinc, with the micronutrient test. But zinc comes from green leafies, pumpkin seeds, oysters, beef, etc. Magnesium, right? Rich sources in coffee, chocolate, nuts, and seeds. Magnesium is a supplement that I'll often end up giving athletes because I feel like they utilize quite a bit of it. It's a great low risk, low intensity muscle relaxer too. It helps with those cramps. And then vitamin D, of course, we all know where that comes from: sun exposure on the skin or supplementation. Now, N-acetylcysteine is one that I'll use. We measure cysteine on the test. N-acetylcysteine is great for anybody with asthma or reactive airway disease because it's a mucolytic. So it's mucolytic and also acts as an antioxidant in those lungs that are inflamed from asthma. So this is a good one to give to people. I'll have athletes take this. I'm in Colorado. It gets cold in the winter. Some people suffer from that, like lung inflammation, that kind of smoker's cough after they're out in the cold weather. If they take a little bit of NAC prior to that run, that really decreases that inflammation, and they're grateful for not having that yucky smoker's cough after exercising in the cold. Of course, CoQ10, super important, increases duration of exercise to exhaustion. So it prolongs the advent of exhaustion and increases maximum power output. Remember, as we age, the number of we don't make as many mitochondria in our cells. Mitochondria, are integral in the production of that CoQ10. So consider supplementing your master's athletes with CoQ10, of course, after you test them on the micronutrient test. And this is an antioxidant. Again, I just got done telling you not to supplement people with this, but this is one of those fine lines where you're going to test and measure first before you decide to supplement people with this one. EPA and DHA, covered those a little bit earlier, but they do have some roles in endurance athletes by improving performance, endurance capacity, inhibiting delayed onset of muscle soreness. That's DOMS. So that's that pain we feel after we work out about 24, 72 hours after a workout. And then also enhances recovery and, of course, can help with the immune system. So I love that part of the test. I'm very fond of looking at the omega-3s and the omega-6 ratio on the test. I think that's very informative because a lot of people don't supplement with omega-3s. And my joke, if you've done some consults with me, is that, how you go to the dentist office, everybody leaves with a free toothbrush. I kind of feel like omega-3s are so important that everybody who comes to our offices should leave with a bottle of omega-3s. So a little more expensive than a cheap plastic toothbrush, but you get my drift. So last one are the branched chain amino acids and or just the regular amino acids. We test a number of these on the micronutrient test. Now, a couple of things to think about with the branched chain amino acids. So this is leucine, isoleucine, and valine on the micronutrient test. If these are low, then we're going to be worried about protein insufficiency. And not only the branched chain aminos, but the other amino acids we test. And I'm kind of on this rant lately that I don't think these athletes consume enough protein, and this is a good way to double check that. I kind of feel like the world is still stuck in carbo loading for whatever reason. Actually, I don't feel that it's true. I used to carbo load in high school in the last century before my cross-country races. And now my kids are in high school sports and they still have the big team pasta dinner before the run. And I'm just saying, somebody please make this stop. But anyway, I digress. Make sure that you're checking branched chain aminos and the other amino acids in your athletes, because if they're low, then we're going to be concerned about how much protein are they getting in their diets. So, and then the other thing to think about is that if those branched chain aminos are elevated, there is a relationship with impaired glycemic control. So if they're high, this person may have some degree of insulin resistance or may be pre-diabetic. So take a look at that. Also caution with supplementing them too, because that can also in turn possibly increase that risk of insulin resistance. And yes, I know we're talking about testing athletes, and you may be saying, well, these people are fit, they're lean, they should not be having insulin resistance issues, but that isn't true. You don't have to be sedentary and overweight to have insulin resistance. So I do see this in athletes. And there's portion of these people who, despite being exceptionally fit, I know a guy like this, he's very fit, very strong, 6% body fat, looks very healthy, but he loves to, eat a half a carton of Oreos after his long run. So people like that can wind up with insulin resistance. So keep that in mind with the branched chain amino acids when you do this test. Okay, quick little segue. I want to talk about exercise and immunity. I would just sum this up by saying it's complicated. We do know that endurance athletes or chronic exercisers are more prone to getting upper respiratory infections, as well as maybe being more prone to GI infections. And there's a couple of interesting explanations for this. And the first one is the J-shaped curve. So this was first hypothesized by Dr. David Neiman in the early 90s. And he just basically described this as that a sedentary person has an average risk of getting sick. And then as a person becomes more fit and exercises more, that risk decreases. But as that exercise gets the volume and the intensity of exercise increases, you see that risk of infection go up quite a bit. Now, this has been around since the 90s. It's definitely had its, it's gone through its paces. Critics of this say that this evidence is more anecdotal than scientific. I'm not sure what to think of that, because in my practice anyway, I feel like I see this too. You get your regular people, non-exercisers or minimal exercisers who get the average amount of illness, and people who kind of do an hour a day, maybe less. And I've definitely had a lot of sick athletes, and not just upper respiratories, but these people can get reactivations of like Epstein-Barr and kind of go down that chronic fatigue road, which is a big problem. But anyway, I thought this was interesting, wanted to share that. And then, so why does this happen? And that why was covered by the open window theory. And what originally happened again when researchers were looking at this is that they noticed that these athletes were immune suppressed about 2 hours up to 8 hours after an intense exercise bout. So they noticed, suppressed total number of lymphocytes and natural killer cells, decreased phagocytic function of neutrophils, and they attributed this immune suppression to the exercise, and that's why they thought that people were getting more sick. But fast forward another 20 or 30 years, and with a lot more research, and what they've discovered of this immune suppression really represents a migration of those leukocytes to more prone areas of the body. So you'll see more leukocytes or white cells in the lungs after an intense exercise bout. So it's actually kind of fascinating that those immune cells move to those areas where somebody is at risk for greatest attack of a pathogen. Now, none of that changes the fact that endurance athletes are more susceptible to upper respiratory tract infections, and like I said, maybe some GI infections. But the research attributes this more to just the stress of training, psychological stresses of training a bunch, competition, working a job, having a family, losing sleep with travel, of course, traveling, trains, planes, automobiles, or, hopping in a little marathon like the Boston Marathon and running with 30,000 of your best friends, plus all the spectators here. And it's a germ factory. You're going to catch stuff like that. So despite all this, this is a huge reason why I like to run this micronutrient test on the athletes I see in my practice. Because, if you have a deficiency of a single immune supportive nutrient, that can bring the whole cascade down. So what I will do is I will use this test frequently, probably every 3 months, leading up, 3 months in the off season, leading up to the competition season, because if you've ever had an athlete who's, worked so hard last year to qualify for the Boston Marathon, you have to qualify for this. You can't just get into this. You have to work very hard to qualify. You bought plane tickets, made travel arrangements, all that time and energy invested in training, and they show up in your office and they're a little upset because now they have a cold or bronchitis or something like that. So that's a no-no. I want to avoid that as much as I can. So I always try to do this testing at least every 3 months to make sure people are on top of the game. Now, you're probably saying, well, this test costs money. It's a big investment, but have you ever talked to a triathlete and had them show you their $15,000 tri-bike with their $4,000 wheels on it, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a little bit of a drop in the bucket to keep them functioning and so that they can go and enjoy their sport. So that's kind of how I put this to athletes, is like, I want to make sure that all these key immune nutrients listed down here are tip top, and we're not going to let them slip and get low so that they get sick. So keep an important eye on that one. Now, a little bit of a shift here too. So we know that exercise can induce intestinal permeability. Now, most of us in the functional medicine world know that intestinal permeability or leaky gut is a transient condition. It happens. It's normal on the one hand, but also it can become pathologic on the other end, depending on the intensity and the duration, et cetera, et cetera. So we've known, back when this was discovered, they discovered that marathon runners suffered from intestinal permeability, but newer research has shown that the dose of exercise required to increase intestinal permeability is much less and likely achieved by many recreational exercisers. So I'll tell you about a couple studies I read for this, and one of them was that they had people run on the treadmill for 20 minutes at 80% maximal oxygen consumption. So that's a fairly good clip for 20 minutes. These people had an increased urinary lactulose to rhamnose ratio that increased by about 250%. And then they had another group of athletes who ran on the treadmill for an hour at 65% VO2 max. So that's kind of like a recovery pace, so fairly easy pace. These people had that ratio, that lactulose to rhamnose urine ratio increased by about 300%. So it doesn't take a lot for somebody to get leaky gut from exercising alone. So of course, when you get leaky gut, we're worried about, taking on all that lipopolysaccharide, creating those inflammatory cytokines, creating a whole systemic mess with this. So why are athletes more prone to intestinal permeability? What happens when they exercise? Well, big issue is that reduction in splanchnic blood flow. So more than 80% of that blood flow is redistributed to the rest of the working muscles in the body. So we know this, don't go swimming on a full stomach, because the blood is not going to go where you want it to. Dehydration is a big deal that contributes to reduced blood flow in the gut tissues. Of course, easy to get dehydrated in the summer months during a run or any other type of activity. Hyperthermia, overheating, also very common in the summertime. This can also exacerbate that intestinal permeability. And of course, we talked about NSAIDs earlier. NSAIDs are just toxic to the intestinal epithelium. Again, they cause erosions, perforations. They contribute to the development of that leaky gut. Again, anything you can do to get people off of using these things, you'll be doing everybody a big favor by doing that. And then gluten is an issue, a causative issue for intestinal permeability in people that are, sensitive to gluten, have celiac disease, or irritable bowel syndrome. So when I'm concerned about this with certain athletes, I will, at the minimum, run Vibrance Intestinal Permeability Panel. You can order this as a one-off test. It's excellent. It looks at zonulin. Of course, that's the protein that maintains the tight junctions in the epithelial border. Actin is the protein within those cells. So if you're seeing actin on this test, you know that there's actually been cellular damage that's occurred. And then we can also measure those lipopolysaccharide levels. So you can run the intestinal permeability, like I said, by itself. It's also part of the wheat Zoomer test. So again, our Zoomer tests are taking that wheat protein and we're cracking it apart, exposing all the different peptides, and we can detect if there's any antigenicity going on with any of those peptides. So it's really taking a fine-tooth comb to those proteins and seeing if there is any reactivity to that. So I would recommend doing this on anybody who you're concerned with any GI issues, even people who say they adhere to a gluten-free diet, right? You need to quantify that. Does that mean they only have cookies at Christmas time, et cetera, et cetera? But anyway, think about running that test. And then also consider doing the gut Zoomer. The gut Zoomer is excellent for looking at, the microbiome among many other analytes. It never fails. Every summer, I get a handful of triathletes in my office who have been swimming in the pool all winter long. They're nice, safe pool. They can see the lane lines on the bottom and they have the lanes on each side of them. And then they go out and swim in the open water in the lakes around here. And that can be very disorienting, and I'm laughing because I've been there. These people end up swallowing quite a bit of lake water, and they can end up with some funky things going on in their gut. So that's when that gut zoomer becomes a good test to run on those folks. Okay, kind of wrapping it up here. Tips for testing your athletes. So of course you want to make sure, and this goes kind of for everybody that comes in your office, but you want to make sure on their best eating behavior, as I call it, the week prior at least. I'll have everybody do a diet diary. That's not because I want to look at it, but only because it makes people more mindful of that they're eating their best diet, because you don't want to do this test on somebody who's been working 60 hours a week and they skipped lunch and drank a pot of coffee every day, et cetera. So, get them when you can on their best eating behavior. Keep in mind, what training phase are they in? Is this a normal condition for them? Right? If somebody ran a marathon last Sunday, I'm not going to want to have them do a micronutrient test this week. Things are going to look all over the place. So try and catch them when they're in their recovery phase, so to speak. And then, keep this stuff in mind for the last 3 months too. So it's going to be hard to catch your athlete in a period of rest necessarily. Of course, there's all kinds of different periods that people are going to follow, but keep in mind, was their stress through the roof? Did they have a major illness? Did they have an injury or an accident, something like that? Supplement changes, diet changes, all those things you want to think about and take into consideration when you're doing the micronutrient test. And then, like I said, I try to do this test every 3 months if I can on the more motivated people, but at least once a year on your athletes, just so they know going into the training and racing season that their diet is actually doing what it's supposed to be doing for them. This is the only test we've got that is really going to show you, other than their signs and symptoms, how effective their diet is. So in conclusion, micronutrient testing is a quick win. So it provides immediately actionable data that can bring quick results. One little story I'll tell you is I'm in a town with a lot of engineers. All these, most of the cyclists here are engineers. I don't know why, but these are very analytical by nature type people. They're very reluctant to add anything into the system that might interfere with their performance, i.e. supplements. So I'll get these fellows in here and, I'll say, let's run the micronutrient test. Hey, look, you're deficient in X, Y, and Z here. Let's try a couple of supplements to bring this up and let's see how you feel. And inevitably they say, wow, I didn't realize that supplements could do this for me, or changing my diet this much would do this for me. So good test to run on people. You can really help people out by knowing where they are in their nutrition. I consider the micronutrient test a foundational test. I would run this on everybody that comes in the door, just like I would a CBC, a chemistry and lipids, hormones. And again, like I said earlier, this is the only way we know that diet is actually, that the food they're eating and the supplements they're eating are being utilized, being absorbed by their body. So we can really cross-check that diet with this test. And then again, it's kind of a great way to clarify those dietary and supplement regimens. So again, there's a whole lot of dietary advice out there. A lot of it's really good. Some of it isn't. Some of it might not be good for that person specifically. So again, we can see how that diet is working. You get people like my engineer guy who doesn't want to take any supplements. And then you get the next person who brings in the grocery bag of supplements. So this is a good way to help people consolidate their supplements, because 30 supplements every day is definitely not going to be sustainable. And then lastly, the micronutrient test is a really great practice builder. Athletes are super fascinated with this test. It's just wonderful. And it's fun to run this test on people and say, look, here's what your nutrition is doing. Here's how we can build on this. People love this. You do this test on one athlete, and then they're going to go tell all their friends, and then they're going to be in your office. So that is everything. Thanks for watching. Thanks for tuning in on a Monday night. I hope you all had a great Monday, and I'm going to turn it back over to Adair for some questions.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Barker, for such an informative, relevant, and meaningful presentation. Let's now begin the Q&A. So one question that came in during your presentation, Dr. Amawi asked if you could repeat why you would not replenish antioxidants with everyone.
Sure, because the research will show that continuous or chronic supplementation with antioxidants is going to inhibit training adaptation. So when we produce free radicals as a result of training, those compounds actually help stimulate mitochondrial biogenesis. So they actually do good things in the body. And if we continue to supplement with those antioxidants, you're going to inhibit that. You're going to slow down those training adaptations. So we want people to adapt and improve from the training. So limiting those antioxidants, that's why we would do that.
Thank you. There was a chat from Victoria. It wasn't a question per se, but I'll have you review that and see if there's anything to comment on there.
Sure. Yeah, Victoria said, might consider just going to ubiquinol, the active form of CoQ10, as we lose this conversion factor as we age. And some people have genetic SNPs that prevent adequate conversion of this as well. Also might consider colostrum for gut tissue repair as well. Yeah, those are excellent ideas. I agree with that. And yeah, makes sense. So yes.
Great. Thank you for addressing that. That looks like we get another one from Rika Ket.
Okay, Rika wrote, if on a restricted diet, how many days would you consider engaging in a regular diet before testing, as a specialized diet will affect test values? So, if a person's, so if somebody's on a restricted diet, let's say they are vegetarian, I wouldn't ask this person to go ahead and, start eating meat. We want to respect everybody's diet as best we can. So if this is a diet that they've been on for some time and they think they want to stick with it and it's working for them, then I would not actually have them change it before the test. Now, the reverse would be true though. Let's say a person has been omnivore for a while and, last week they decided, I'm going to be a vegan and I want you to test me. No, we don't want to do that because it hasn't been enough time to reflect those changes in the testing.
Great, that makes total sense. Okay, are there any other questions for Dr. Barker before we end today? Well, Dr. Barker, I'm not seeing any questions coming in. So with that, I want to thank all of our attendees. Thank you so much for your engagement and your business. Vibrant appreciates your support and the work that you are doing to advance the functional medicine, disease prevention, and wellness model. Immediately following this webinar, you will receive a short survey. We'd love for you to complete that survey so we can gain insight into how well we are meeting your needs and also how we may improve our clinical lab education programs, products, and services we offer you. Thanks again and have a good night, everyone. Take care.